How do police execute a no-knock warrant without their body cams being activated? Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, and for the last little while we have been hearing a lot on the news about the defund the police movement, less so in Canada, but we've been still hearing about it in Canada. And it's something I said from the beginning, defund the police is not really a movement that you are going to get the entire world behind, but demilitarize the police you might get a lot more support for. And the tragic story of Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old EMT who was killed in a wild shootout during the execution of a no-knock warrant, is the perfect illustration of why it might be a good idea to demilitarize the police. Now, Breonna Taylor's estate has filed suit for wrongful death, and we're going to walk through that suit in a second. There are a lot of things we don't know, but there are a lot of things we do know, and one thing we do know is that this situation should never have occurred. Tamika Palmer as administratrix of the estate of Breonna Taylor versus Brett Hankinson, Miles Cosgrove, and Jonathan Mattingly. Defendants. Preliminary statement. At 12:30 a.m. on March 13, 2020, both Breonna Taylor and Kenneth Walker were asleep in their bedroom. Breonna was scheduled to work later in the day. Breonna was a licensed EMT and worked for 2 local hospitals. Kenneth, her boyfriend, was set to begin his new position with the Postal Service. Neither of the two had any criminal history for drugs or violence. Neighbors described Breonna and Kenneth as quiet and peaceful. Friends and family described the two as loving and caring. While Breonna and Kenneth were sleeping peacefully, the 3 defendants arrived in their neighborhood in plain clothes in unmarked vehicles. The defendants were working within the Criminal Interdiction Unit of the Louisville Metro Police Department. The defendants had a knock and announce search warrant for Breonna's apartment, where the officers were searching for an individual who lived in a different part of Louisville. Now, it seems that one of the critical disputed facts in this entire lawsuit is whether the police had a no-knock warrant or a knock and announce warrant. Now, the lawsuit, which was filed in April, says that it was a knock and announce warrant, but some more recent articles from the New York Times said that it was in fact a no-knock warrant. But as far as I am concerned, whether it was in fact a no-knock warrant or a knock and announce warrant, it should not end with the officers firing over 20 blind rounds into the house, killing an innocent person in that house. The officers then entered Breonna's home without knocking and without announcing themselves as police officers. The defendants then proceeded to spray gunfire into the residence with a total disregard for the value of human life. Shots were blindly fired by the officers all throughout Breonna's home and also into the adjacent home where a 5-year-old child and a pregnant mother had been sleeping. Breonna Taylor was shot at least 8 times by the officers' gunfire and died as a result. Breonna had posed no threat to the officers and did nothing to deserve to die at their hands. The plaintiff brings this personal injury and wrongful death action in order to obtain damages resultant from the defendant's unlawful conduct, which directly and proximately caused the death of a young, beautiful human being who was also an essential frontline medical professional in this community. One critical fact is whether or not the warrant was a no-knock warrant versus a knock and announce warrant. Another critical disputed fact is who shot first. Apparently, Breonna's boyfriend, who was a lawful gun owner, is said to have fired the first round at the advancing officers, injuring one of them in the leg. The lawsuit does not mention this, which I think is a strategic mistake, which we will get to, because if it is in fact a fact, it's going to come out sooner than later, and as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really change whether or not the officers should have returned fire by firing upwards of 20 blind rounds into the residence. But in law, I think the best thing to do is in fact to get ahead of the bad or unfavorable facts, because they are going to come out and there is no point ignoring them. Set them out and respond to them before the adverse party sets them out themselves. The estate goes on to lay out certain facts, but bear in mind these are the facts only according to one party, the petitioning party. These facts have not yet been proven. They are mere allegations. They may not be the complete facts. You have yet to hear from the defendants. This is only the story according to one party. Breonna Taylor was 26 years old on March 13, 2020. She was a critical frontline employee during the beginning phases of the coronavirus pandemic, working for both Jewish and Norton hospitals. Breonna was also a certified EMT. Other than a couple of speeding tickets, Breonna had no criminal history. She was non-violent and posed no threat to the community. Breonna had no drugs in her home. Kenneth, who had a license to carry, kept firearms in the home for protection. Kenneth also had no history of violence and no history of drug offenses. The defendants were each working at the time. Defendant Mattingly was an LMPD sergeant at the time Breonna was shot. Defendant Cosgrove was an LMPD officer at the time Breonna was shot. Cosgrove has a prior history of shooting a Louisville resident 7 times. Defendant Hankinson has a prior history of unnecessary force and corruption within his employment. Hankinson's documented use of force history within the LMPD is pages long, documenting dozens of situations where he has sent citizens to the hospitals for injuries from being tased, pepper sprayed, and struck repeatedly in the nose and eyes. Hankinson has taken out his anger both while on the job and during his off-duty security detail at bars on Shelbyville Road. He has a history of fighting with citizens, breaking out car windshields with flashlights, and punching citizens with such force that Hankinson himself has needed stitches in his hand. The lawsuit then goes on to allege that the officers did not carry out the proper risk assessment prior to conducting the search warrant. LMPD requires that a risk assessment matrix be completed prior to the service of all search warrants. There is a ministerial duty imposed upon LMPD commanding officers to complete an arrest search warrant information sheet and notify the Special Weapons and Tactics SWAT team commander to coordinate a response if the risk assessment matrix score necessitates the use of the SWAT unit, or the situation requires a mandatory SWAT unit callout as listed on the risk assessment matrix regardless of the score. The defendants, none of whom were assigned to the SWAT unit at the time of the subject incident, each had a ministerial duty to refrain from executing the warrant on Breonna's home if either of the factors in paragraphs 26A or 26B above were present. The defendants did not adhere to this duty. The lawsuit goes on to allege that the defendants further failed in other ministerial duties in that they didn't even plan a hospital road, and the hospital road had to be planned after they fired their 20+ shots into the residence. And getting back to the critical disputed fact as to whether or not it was a no-knock warrant versus a knock and announce warrant, the lawsuit alleges as follows. Before entry to Breonna's home was made by the defendants, the defendant officers each had a ministerial duty to identify themselves as law enforcement officers and state their intent to execute a search. The defendants did not adhere to this duty. The defendants each had a ministerial duty to comply with the terms of the warrant, which, upon information and belief, included knocking and announcing themselves prior to entering Breonna's home and confirming prior to execution that probable cause still existed for the warrant's execution. The defendants did not adhere to this duty. The defendants, even with a valid search warrant, had a ministerial duty to call off the warrant's execution if the probable cause listed on the affidavit no longer existed. The defendants did not adhere to this duty. As confirmed by multiple neighbors, the defendant officers did not knock or identify themselves prior to entering Breonna's home. Knocking and announcing is critical for a warrant of this nature to be executed safely. Reasons include but are not limited to the following. A. The officers were in plain clothes. B. It was 12:40 in the morning. C. The home was part of a large unit of connected homes containing children. D. There was nothing to indicate that Breonna Taylor and Kenneth would flee or pose an unreasonable danger if the officers knocked and identified themselves as police. And E. Individuals, under several circumstances, have a lawful right to use deadly force in order to defend against those who enter their home. The defendant officers breached the front door and entered the home without knocking and without announcing themselves. The critical disputed fact as to whether or not it was in fact a no-knock warrant. If it was a no-knock warrant, then the police apparently would not have had the obligation to identify themselves prior to breaching the premises. A third critical disputed fact is whether or not the police did in fact identify themselves before entering the premises. According to the police, they did identify themselves before busting down the door, but according to the lawsuit, they did not. Even assuming the police officers did identify themselves before entering the premises, the question is then going to be whether or not that could possibly justify firing over 20 blind rounds into the residence. The defendant officers breached the front door and entered the home without knocking and without announcing themselves. Breonna and Kenneth were awakened by the defendant's unannounced entry into their home. They believed that their home had been broken into by criminals and that they were in significant imminent danger. Kenneth proceeded to call 911. The defendant officers fired their weapons into Breonna's home repeatedly. The defendants fired several shots into the home from outside on the patio. The living room was obscured by curtains. The officers could not see anything inside the home past the curtains within their line of fire when shooting into the home through the glass. The defendants fired several shots into the home from outside of the second bedroom window. The second bedroom window was obscured by a screen and blinds. There was no way that the officers could have had a reasonable line of sight when firing into the home from outside this window. The defendants did not have discretion to shoot blindly into Breonna's home in this manner. Now, as of the present date, by all accounts, it does seem that Kenneth, Breonna's boyfriend, in fact opened fire on the police officers, and the lawsuit does not mention this, and I think it's something of a strategic mistake not to have gotten ahead of this bad fact instead of just ignoring it in the lawsuit. If this is in fact true, you know it's going to come out sooner than later, so you may as well get ahead of the ball by mentioning it now, and when it comes to executing a no-knock search warrant, I don't think it's going to change much in terms of the facts. There is a way of explaining this away without compromising the position of the plaintiff, and subsequent developments in policy in Louisville are going to further illustrate that, but before we get into that, let's just finish up with the lawsuit. The officers failed to use any sound, reasonable judgment whatsoever when firing more than 25 blind shots into multiple homes and causing the wrongful death of Breonna. The defendants had absolute, certain, and imperative duties to knock, announce their presence, give Breonna and Kenneth notice that they were peace officers there to serve a warrant, offer to show Breonna and Kenneth the warrant, and afford the opportunity to be let into the home. Breonna had committed no crime, posed no immediate threat to the safety of the defendants, and did not actively resist or attempt to evade arrest prior to being repeatedly shot and killed by the defendants. And then we go through the various counts of the lawsuit. Battery, wrongful death, excessive force in violation of KRS 431.025, negligence, and gross negligence. When it comes to discussions about demilitarizing the police, no-knock warrants are a very interesting subject. Their use has gone up exponentially since the 1980s when they were first implemented. According to Wikipedia, there were something like 1,500 no-knock warrants annually in the early 80s, and by 2010 there were something like 45,000 annual no-knock warrants executed. I don't know how one reconciles no-knock warrants with the right to self-defense, the castle doctrine, that is the ability to defend one's home and property, but one thing is for certain: they are prone to leading to these types of deadly incidents. So much so, in fact, that since the Breonna Taylor incident, as of late May, Louisville has banned no-knock warrants. As part of the fallout of the incident, Brett Hankinson was fired and the other 2 officers were placed on administrative reassignment, so it already doesn't look good for the defendants. And if you can believe it, Breonna's boyfriend Kenneth was actually charged with attempted murder of a police officer, although that charge was subsequently dismissed in May. The entire incident is purely tragic. It sounds like a bad movie, and it's very reminiscent of Waco and what happens with the militarization of the police. Give the police military-type forces like this and they will use it with tragic consequences like this. We will see where this goes, but this is a lawsuit to settle, even if all of the disputed facts work against the plaintiff in that there was in fact a no-knock warrant. If her boyfriend did in fact fire first, it does not justify the outcome in this situation. When there are developments in the story, I will do a vlog on it. In the meantime, if you like my videos and you like my content, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment in the comment section below because it feeds the algorithm. If you want to support the channel, you know what to do, but above all else, take care of yourselves, look after your friends and family, make sure everyone around you is doing well, and now you know your vlog. Peace out.